Today we're on to the second of 3 episodes in my Singing Monsters Grand Prix, and for the first time I'm actually doing something different with My Singing Monsters today, not just making them more monstrous versions of themselves. I'm gonna do a classic topic from this channel and take some of the monsters and redesign them and rewrite them to fit into different superhero universes. Gonna do what if one was in Marvel, what if one was in DC, and what if one was in my new original series Vigilants, which itself is already 9 episodes deep. Got some fun art and stories coming, so let's get into it, shall we? Let's go!
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show.
Garth Bowman had always been fascinated by superheroes, especially those who courageously protected the innocent without the aid of any superhuman abilities. The Batman of Gotham, and to a greater extent, Green Arrow of Star City. Batman was impressive, but a bit too grim of a hero for Garth to idolize. Green Arrow had been a killer at one point early in his career, which didn't resonate with Garth's morals, but since his debut had become a hero much more in line with what Garth wanted to be. Garth even strove to move to Star City someday to work alongside the Emerald Archer. He'd taken up archery himself when he was 11, and by the time he was 17, had world-class skills with a bow. But target sports and superhero training were not his only passions. He also loved music and was a prodigy with a cello. Melding his passions together, he even made himself a bow that could be played in a similar fashion to a cello. On his first outings in his home city to train in superheroing, he'd approach a crime in process, stay hidden, and play a threatening and suspenseful melody with the intent of this being his calling card to villains. So when they heard that, they knew they were about to be taken out by the hero, Bowstrom. He spent a few months before the end of high school apprehending criminals in his home city, still intending to move out to Star City. But before he ever left, something changed. He found something he really liked about his home city. One night he'd followed a group of criminals into the local museum's Dawn of Fire exhibit, where some incredibly rare fossils and artifacts were on display. He hid in the shadows, starting up his song, but to his surprise, as he played, an angelic voice started singing along with his tune. The voice and his strings echoed through the museum, and the criminals spun around, pointing their guns, looking for a target. Eventually, they spotted something above and began to fire, but missed every shot. Garth saw it too, a figure swooping just below the ceiling of the museum, gracefully dodging all the bullets that zipped her way. The criminals all eventually ran out of bullets and tried to reload, but as they did, the flying figure swooped down, grabbed one, raised him into the air, and tossed him at another of the crooks. As she was doing this, a third got his gun reloaded and aimed, but Bowstrom fired an arrow and knocked the gun from his hand. Garth fired another custom-made arrow that split into bolas and wrapped around the criminal, binding his arms, then another at his legs. The flying feathered figure took out the last couple of criminals, then flew down to meet Garth. She was a masked figure in a feathered costume who introduced herself as Tweedla, stating that this very event had been her audition to be his new superheroing partner. She was surprisingly forward about her intention, but claimed that she had been given a vision that she was supposed to team up with Garth, and that together they'd find many other musically inclined heroes to create a new group with that one day would rival the fame of the Justice League. Garth was a bit skeptical as she got into the details of this vision. She claimed that it had come from a group of other dimensional colossal new gods who'd discovered the life equation that countered the anti-life equation that the menace Darkseid was often seeking. They claimed that a key to properly using the life equation, which could help all life thrive in the universe, was music, hence wanting there to be more musically inclined heroes. They'd used the equation to grant abilities to various different heroes on Earth, and Tweedla was one of those beings. All of this seemed a bit overly fantastical to Garth, who focused more on ground-level hero work. But even still, after going on a few missions with Tweedla by his side, he found her chatty and cheerful demeanor to be hard to dislike. He even particularly enjoyed the parallel that she was to him what Black Canary was to his hero Green Arrow, a superpowered bird-themed hero who could be a huge help against the odd superpowered foe they came across. Eventually, Garth even gave up on the idea of leaving to fight with Green Arrow in Star City, and just started embracing being one of the resident heroes of his home city. He and Tweedla grew closer and closer over the years, and while the feathery hero was still convinced by the vision she'd seen to start a new super team someday, they both did answer the call when they eventually became big enough names to have the Justice League reach out to them for assistance. There was a potential new world-ending event begun by the villainous Vandal Savage, and it was all hands on deck. Despite having let go of the dream of fighting with Green Arrow, Bostrom got his chance anyway, as he and Arrow were put alongside each other in the field and got to bond over their many similarities. While it hadn't come about the way he'd planned, Garth had gotten everything he could have wanted and more out of his superheroing career, and there were still many more good years to come. There have been many theories over the years of what the origins of mutants truly is. Some think that these superpowered beings, like those of the X-Men, simply came about naturally as the next stage in human evolution. But a lesser-known theory involving otherworldly cosmic beings may have recently gotten more evidence to validate it. Some believe that a race of massive, powerful entities called the Celestials came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago and genetically altered some species they found, which would eventually lead to an offshoot of humanity with abilities, now known as mutants. But what if there was another step in that process that we had missed? You see, on a recent adventure, the X-Men were searching the Savage Lands for a dangerous pseudo-mutant called Sauron. He often made the secluded dinosaur-swarmed Savage Lands his base of operations, but as the X-Men sought him out, they found something much more interesting. They'd ventured down into unexplored caves of the Savage Lands and eventually came into a massive temple-like opening, inside of which were a dozen intricately carved, alien-looking boxes that were nearly as tall as the mutants who found them. Actually, taller than Wolverine. The team's noble leader, Cyclops, eventually went up to one of the boxes and tried to brush some dust off of it. As soon as he did, he yelled out and collapsed to the ground. The others ran over to him as the box he'd touched began sparking with electricity and shaking. Cyclops suddenly pulled off his visor and revealed that his eyes no longer shot optic beams when open. The box had taken his mutant abilities. It continued to shake, then began to warp and transform. It eventually stood up into a 13-foot-tall humanoid being with lightning flowing between its limbs to connect them. It looked down at the mutants who were all ready for a fight. "What did you do to the Boy Scouts' powers, bub?" The being replied by slowly lowering its hand to Scott and gently tapping his forehead. His eyes immediately shot crimson beams once more right at the being, but it simply held out its hand and blocked the blast, doing no damage to the giant whatsoever. Cyclops put his visor back on as the being started to make strange electronic musical noises that somehow they all understood as speech. It explained that it and its brethren had been placed on Earth by the Celestials 1,000,000 years ago and given free rein to help the species of this planet evolve in whatever way they saw fit. It admitted to being inspired to evolve life on Earth based on remembrances of a group of other beings they'd briefly encountered in the Savage Lands, also made by the Celestials, called the Eternals. This being claimed it had the ability to grant and take away the mutant gene, and they'd put that very gene into some select early Neanderthals so that eventually parts of humanity would develop abilities. These beings had incredible power themselves as well, but many of them had also adapted their abilities by staying in a specific climate or region for a certain length of time. So, while they all had comparable strength, they had varying power sets. Though none had used their abilities in quite some time. For hundreds of thousands of years now, they'd simply lain dormant until they could eventually be awakened to see how their evolutionary efforts had unfolded. They could only be awakened by being touched by someone with the mutant gene, and temporarily absorb that gene from the person to power them up. Now that the X-Men had found them, all of these beings, known as the Wubboxmen, could be awakened and continue to help mutant kind thrive on what had become of Earth since they began their slumber. The X-Men were obviously a bit skeptical on a few fronts. For one, they'd come across many beings before who claimed to want what was best for mutants, only to do awful things in the name of that goal. On top of that, they had no way to verify what this being was claiming as true. As a show of good faith, the Wubboxmen that they'd awoken already aided them on their adventure to seek out Sauron. They were able to find the human pterodon hybrid, who himself had once absorbed the X gene from another mutant to cause his own mutation, and the Wubboxmen took his powers temporarily to make it easy to apprehend him. Thereafter, the X-Men agreed to help awaken the other Wubboxmen in the cavern, but informed them that if these beings did anything to harm human or mutant kind in the name of their goals, the X-Men would have to do what they could to stop them. The Wubboxmen agreed, stating that for the time being they'd simply seek out the others of their kind, who'd fallen into slumber buried in other various parts of the world. They would largely stay out of human and mutant affairs other than observing, except on occasions when the X-Men would call upon them for aid, in situations where the Wubboxmen would be incredible allies, using their own Omega-level mutant abilities to help make the world a safer place. Our minds have a natural protective negativity bias. When our ancestors were out hunting or foraging for food, if they heard the leaves rustling behind them, it could save their life to assume it was a dangerous predator trying to devour them. Unfortunately, that bias still lingers in the structure of our minds today, and can translate into how we perceive social situations. This was an issue in the early life of Thena Aulos. She had been born with the same superhuman abilities as her mother and grandmother, both of whom had been renowned fighters in the Greek Vigilants League, and were both famous in particular for their spectacular, vibrant feathered arms that they boldly displayed with balletic grace, as they used them to fly through the air during battles, and fling fireballs down at their foes from afar. Their flight, firepower, and superhuman eyesight made for a powerful competitive pairing. That and their consistent training routines had given both the older Aulos women incredible vigilance careers. Both Thena's mom and grandma had been known for their colorful outfits as well, one with bright blue attire and the other bright orange, and Thena had felt a lot of pressure to dress and act the same. But that wasn't what she wanted at all. At an early age, she did develop the same abilities as her mother, putting her in the 22.2% of people in the world who develop natural superhuman abilities, giving her the option to possibly compete in the world's most famous sports competition, the Global Vigilants League. The aesthetic of her family's powers even made her look almost like a person who got her abilities by bonding with one of the superpowered creatures, called Bionites, to be found on the island country of Unitalia. Though Thena's appearance wasn't quite like that of her mom or grandma. Thena's fluffy feathers on her forearms were much more muted in color, and the wings she could sprout that allowed her to fly were much more like that of a bat than an elegant phoenix. She had expressed an interest in fighting in the Greek Vigilance League herself after getting her powers, but was then told by some of her relatives, "Oh, we can just dye your feathers, put you in your mom's old outfits, then you'll look just like the other Aulos Vigilants and keep the legacy going." From then on, Thena feared that if she pursued a career as a Vigilance League fighter, everyone would expect her to look exactly like her mother. But that was practically the opposite of how Thena wanted to present herself. She loved her darker, more muted feathers, and wasn't as bubbly and extroverted as her mother. Sure, she could enjoy herself in a crowd or at a party, but she preferred to spend time reading grim poetry and watching horror movies and training late into the night instead of getting up early like her mother. For a while, though, she just tried to do what she thought everyone wanted. She dressed in bright colors for her battles in the high school Vigilance League and performed admirably enough, but never felt like she was being her true self. She tried to ignore the bad and just acted grateful that she had a natural gift for vigilance competitions and a mother who could train her, but all the while it just felt wrong. Eventually, Thena was scouted to fight in the amateur Greek Vigilance League. That meant soon she'd be fighting in a tournament where she'd make her small-time television debut, showing much of her country what to expect from the next generation of her family's fighters. Thena realized as the competition approached that if she didn't embrace the look she truly wanted to embody now, then she could end up trapped as an imitation of her mom forever. Despite being terrified of her mom disapproving, Thena started crafting her own outfit, one that matched her feathers and the aesthetic she truly wanted. One that was more dark and grim and much more her. A week before the competition, Thena put on the finished outfit and walked into her room where her mother was working. Her heart was pounding, but she still said, "This is what I want to wear to the tournament." Her mother looked it up and down and responded, "I love it, honey. Oh, so much more you. I'll fix up the hemming and I think you could change up." Her mom went on with some minor tweaks she could make, but Thena was just confused by how chill her mom was being. Wait, so you don't want me to dress like you and Grandma did?" Her mom replied, "Oh, of course not, dear. Unless you wanted to. You've been wearing my old outfit so long, I started to think that was what you wanted, but I think it's about time someone in our family did something different." Thena was dumbfounded. She'd spent years thinking her mom wanted her to follow directly in the family footsteps, but then realized that she'd never actually taken a moment to just ask. She was then still worried to show her grandma, being sure she'd be bothered by the attire, but her grandma's only comment upon seeing her in the outfit was, "Oh, it's so skinny. Are you eating enough, Thina?" Thina had been assuming all this time that people wouldn't be okay with her being herself, but it turned out everyone who mattered to her had just wanted her to be whoever it made her happy to be. She debuted her attire at the amateur Greek tournament, and it seemed like tons of people were excited by the new visual direction for the Aulos family. She wouldn't take first place in that tournament, but would perform far better than most first-timers in that league would, and it would set her on a fantastic track for an incredible Vigilance career, embraced by new fans who loved her vibe, and many who'd eagerly cheered on her elders. But the most important thing Thina had learned from that experience was to be her true self, and trust that the people who mattered to her would always accept and embrace it, no matter what the negativity bias in her mind might be trying to tell her.
If you enjoyed this episode, I highly recommend checking out my new series Vigilance, in which that last story was set. That story isn't going to be canon to Vigilance because I'm keeping Vigilance free of any direct pop culture ripoff characters, so that I can publish it as a book when season 1 is finished, but there are a ton of great stories in there, some of my best I've written. Or of course you might like any of my other My Singing Monsters videos. If you didn't see last week's, it was my newest My Singing Monsters More Monstrous video, or I have a whole compilation of all the previous episodes in that series that I'll link in the description. All those episodes I just mentioned I'll link below. And keep your eye out on the My Singing Monsters channel within the next week for an interesting announcement that might be coming up. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is a quote that I don't actually remember who it's from, but I really like, and it's that when you're in some kind of difficult, upsetting situation, it's a really good idea to ask yourself, what's the difference between the story I'm telling myself and what's actually happening? When we're in difficult situations, it can be very easy for our minds to just race into worse and worse possible scenarios and tell ourselves stories about what other people are thinking about that situation. And often, if we take a moment to step back and think about the difference between the story we're telling ourselves and what we actually know, we can see that the story that we're making up around the whole thing is actually so much worse. Sometimes the actual thing happening isn't even really that bad, it's just the story we're telling ourselves that's making it so much worse. I hope that's inspiring, I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday, where I'm redesigning some mythological monsters based on suggestions set in the Mytholethal storyline. I'll see you there, goodbye.